Hi, welcome back to Space Thoughts. It's New Year's Eve 2020 as I'm making this video right now, and 2020 has been a very hectic year, a very difficult year for all of us in terms of what's been going on outside the world, outside of the normal course of geopolitics and international law, and space for that matter. I'm going to do the fourth installment of my 2020 hot list, which I base on my briefing letter, The Pressy, and that fourth quarter issue actually came out on December 18th, just a couple of weeks ago. And now I'm going to sit down and based on that briefing letter, I'm going to give you what I think are some of the hot items for the fourth quarter 2020. Now, after that, what I'm going to do, since it's the end of the year, I'm going to sit down and give you my top 5 events in space law and policy, international law, geopolitics, etc., that I think were the most significant in terms of, most impactful in terms of international law and policy. So again, this will be 5 things after I get done my original hot list. Before we start, if you're a subscriber, I thank you for subscribing. It motivates me more to sit down and make these videos and, share my ideas and create more content for the channel. So if you're a subscriber, thank you. If you're not a subscriber and you like to subscribe, please feel I would welcome you as a subscriber. And you can always hit that little bell on the bottom to notify you whenever a new video comes up. So we're going to get right to it because this will be a little bit longer video than my normal hot list. So without further ado, what's hot? Fourth quarter 2020. Now there was a lot going on this quarter and a lot of things that I wasn't really able to extrapolate a lot on in my briefing letter because of the fact that I put it out a week earlier given the holidays and such. But I'm going to go through on the fourth quarter and tell you what I think is hot. First up, FAA final rule, streamlined launch and re-entry license requirements. This was actually a mandate from Space Policy Directive 2 back in 2018, and basically told the FAA to make it less bureaucratic, consolidate it, and such. And the FAA did a pretty good job of it. There was some initial resistance among the first draft, along with some of the smaller commercial entities, commercial operators, if these are still too complex. But essentially, the FAA did a pretty good job of simplifying and consolidating all the regulations into basically one chapter or one section of the Code of Federal Regulations, which will be effective in March. So, I'm not entirely happy with the outcome of the streamlined rules. I still think they're really burdensome and complicated. It is a big improvement from what we had before, i.e. there are less you don't have to flip through the Code of Regulations to look for a lot of things because most of the licensing requirements are going to be consolidated into one section of the Code of Federal Regulations. So that is a big one, and that has been delayed, of course, because of what's going on in the world and the delays that it's caused. Department of Defense electromagnetic spectrum superiority strategy. This, I think, is very significant. When we think of spectrum, we really don't think of outer space, but spectrum is extremely important for outer space. I think I mentioned in a prior video that the FCC here in the United States has basically claims on-orbit authority and licensing authorization authority for commercial satellite operators based on spectrum rules, based on the fact that they are basically mandate the idea of how spectrum is utilized by U.S. citizens. So basically what the Department of Defense does, and this is some sort of a national security item, is they basically look through and recognize that spectrum is important not only for military aspects, but also for civilian economic aspects as well. In fact, that, in my opinion, constitutes national security. So the whole idea is, the strategy is how to manage the spectrum, how to defend it against the spectrum, and how to use the spectrum. And I think this is a very significant one and definitely worthy of my hot list for the fourth quarter. Draft Space-Based Communication Policy of India. We're still into spectrum here, but this time it's from India. And basically what India has done is they've taken the idea of, they basically consolidate their policy around communication satellites, or again, spectrum. And what India does, again, it recognized, like the U.S., it's recognized the importance of spectrum for space-based operations and the utility and need for its communication satellites. Now, India, compared to the U.S., doesn't have as many communication satellites or as broad a network as such, but it's still highly significant for their national security and for Well, there are economics and their civilian use, which again relates back to national security. So fundamentally what this does is it recognizes that it basically, the strategy says we need to defend it, but more significantly, it lets private actors into the field and allows them to participate and provide services for the state of, for India as a state. So this is a very significant event. It's still a draft, and I think the comments on it closed recently. But this is an interesting step because again, it recognizes the importance of spectrum, which we don't think about a lot in terms of outer space as it relates to the overall security and the ability to perform space activities or even perform economic activities. Draft insurance and liabilities requirements to implement the Space Industry Act of 2018. This is from our friends in the United Kingdom, and fundamentally they came out with this basically addresses how we're going to address liability and licensing and such, and how do we address the risk of it all. And this is a pretty significant in the sense that not only does it say, okay, this is this is how you're going to apply for a license, and these are the things you have to address, but it also provides a consultation mechanism called the Traffic Light System, TLS for short. And basically what it does, it preliminarily allows a private operator to come to the UK agency regulating this and saying, look, can you give us some hints? Can you show us, based on what we're doing, this is kind of an idea what we're going to do. What do you think? And the UK agency would go back and say, okay, based on this, we think it's either going to be very low risk in terms of the UK's liability, medium risk, or high risk. And the whole idea is to give the operator an idea of the amount of hoops it's going to have to jump through in order to get a license. Now, the idea behind the TLS system is it doesn't really create a system of an advisory system, and it doesn't guarantee a license, but it kind of gives an operator, a private operator, especially a newcomer, a feel for what kind of licensing requirements and what kind of information they're going to have to provide a UK agency in order to obtain an operator's license. Artemis Accords, big one. They were recently signed back in October. Started out with 7 signatories, added 8 with Ukraine back in November, and Brazil has signed a memorandum of understanding to actually become a signatory to the Artemis Accords as well. I think this is, again, the Artemis Accords are highly significant. I've talked about it before in videos, in that this is operating outside of the UN system. Not totally, in a sense, it is negotiating outside of the UN system, but not totally ignoring the UN system. In other words, they will come back to the UN and report to, this is what we're doing. I think this is very important in terms of space resources, and in fact, I think space resources is tied heavily to this. And it gives it really is a new paradigm in how space governance is going to emerge. And as I mentioned before in a prior video, the Artemis Accords don't supplant the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is there. However, it builds on that framework. And actually, the Artemis Accords in themselves are a framework that can be built upon. As more experience is gained, more agreements will be made to actually fine-tune the the rules, or how can you say, rules of the road, I guess is the best term you could come up with, on how different state actors are going to interact in outer space, on the moon, or even on asteroids or comets for that matter. And it's interesting that the Artemis Accords in the title actually mentions comets. And again, I did a video on this a few months ago. If you want to go back and look at that, I talk a little bit more in depth about the Artemis Accords and such. Moon Village Association, best practice for sustainable lunar activities. Moon Village has been around for a few years now, and it's just started coming out with some of its best practices. I've talked about Moon Village in my briefing letter, and if you're a subscriber to that, you can go back and look what I have to say about it. But the idea is Moon Village is offering practices that are going to be promulgated through the UN system itself. In other words, it's not going to bypass the UN system like the Artemis Accords does, but rather it's looking to implement eventually a treaty type of program, what we call top-down, in order to facilitate this. So in essence, really, in my opinion, the Artemis Accords and the route Moon Village is taking is pretty much, they kind of like clash, because one is bottom up. In other words, we're dealing state to state here without the UN, without a formal treaty, whereas Moon Village Association and the best practices and principles that they're going to be setting forth are actually going to the idea is to actually bring those into a formal treaty. Again, you know, my loathing of treaties is basically they take a long time, they're always usually pretty vague, and they're hard to really enforce. And of course, how do you interpret them? I mean, they can become very loose, and again, because of the fact that they're very loose, they take a long time, especially if you're dealing with multiple parties. Whereas the Artemis Accords are a lot more flexible in the approach when you're dealing with separate states, or you know, a smaller number of states, and starting to bring everybody into the fold. So again, I think is highly significant. Even though I'm not a big fan of the Moon Village Association's best practices and the approach they're taking, it is significant, and actually, in my opinion, a competitor to the Artemis Accords. United Kingdom draft resolution on responsible behavior in space, and this is something that came up actually in the third quarter, and this gained more traction here in the fourth quarter. Basically, these were brought before this was presented before the UN, and I don't have a copy of them yet, of the draft, because they're still in draft form. But the whole idea is we're going to create responsible rules for engagement in outer space, and this kind of has echoes of the EU Code of Conduct and its successor, the International Code of Conduct, which pretty much kind of fell on its face and is really a non-factor right now, in my opinion. This it appears to be a similar effort, but I also tend to make it more of what I call a lawfare effort, as it really is kind of going against what, you know, the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China are trying to do with formal treaties for space weapons. Again, this isn't an idea of they're looking for, the UK is looking for a formal treaty, but rather they're looking more for, you know, to get some sort of quote, and I hate to use the word norms, but I'm going to use the word norms for responsible behavior. There's been there was a kick up in the UN about this at the first committee, and if you subscribe to my briefing letter in the fourth quarter, you can read the play-by-play, or you can even look up the first on the internet on basically at the UN site. There's a pretty good synopsis of what happened there. But again, these are highly significant. I think it gives that gives UK some prestige and definitely some soft power geopolitically. And at the same time, it's also a lawfare mechanism, in my opinion, against basically treaty efforts by the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. Finally, U.S. national space policy, and this kind of, you know, came up on the radar. In my opinion, personally, I thought I didn't expect it. I haven't had a chance to really look through it at all, but this is significant because it's the first. It basically replaces the 2010 national space policy. So that basically means 10 years of, it's been 10 years since a new national space policy has been implemented. The current administration has been, what they've been doing with the former space policies, has been tweaking it with space policy directives in order to you know, make it more amenable to the administration's goals. But I didn't, you know, but in this case, this is a whole new ball of wax. It completely replaces PPD4, I believe it is, the National Space Policy of 2010, and it is space policy for the U.S. How that's implemented going forward remains to be seen. I have yet to analyze it. I'll probably be doing a special issue of my briefing letter to deal with that specifically. So that's my hot list for fourth quarter 2020. So now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm going to go back to I'm going to give you my top 5 items that I think were most prominent in 2020. Top 5 hot items for 2020. Artemis Accords and Executive Order 13914 on space resources. I think this is extremely significant to the extent that it is the first major, how can you say, executive action by the U.S. on space resources since the Space Resource Law was passed back in 2015. A long time went on space resources without any action from Congress further legislating. And there was a lot of, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of diplomatic action going at the international level, at the UN, and the State Department is to be commended for its work. But behind the scenes, as far as anything coming from the executive branch or the legislative branch, there really wasn't a lot of formal refining of the idea. That changed with the Artemis Accords, and I tie that with the Executive Order 13914 because I think space resources is pretty much encompasses what is the heart of the Artemis Accords in general for future non-governmental exploitation of space resources. And of course, we've kind of seen that with the NASA solicitation, where NASA is basically contracted with 3 companies to go out and go land a lander on the moon, harvest some samples, keep them there, and ownership will be basically NASA will pay the owners of that company for those samples, and otherwise those samples will become the government of the property of the U.S. government. So that would be a first example of space resources, and I think the Artemis Accords and Executive Order 13914 facilitate that, making it extremely important, and again, giving more how you can say, muscle to bottom-up approaches versus top-down approaches. UAE National Space Law. I did a video on this a few months ago after it came out, and I also did a special issue of my briefing letter on this. To say the least, I'm very impressed with the UAE National Space Law. It was very well drafted. I know the attorney who helped draft it, and basically this is just an excellent space law. They really thought it through, and it took a long time to come around because it's something that's on the back burner. And if you're subscribed to my briefing letter, you'll see I've been mentioning it for the past 3 years or so. It finally came out formally. Last year. Was implemented, I believe, I think at the beginning of this year or last year, and a public version of it actually came out back in April. So very, very significant law, most importantly because it has a space resource provision like the U.S. and like Luxembourg, making it the third state to adopt a domestic space resource law, and basically the first state in the Middle East to actually recognize that, as opposed to some of its neighbors which have opted for the Moon Treaty. Final rule, licensing of private remote sensing space systems. This was a significant change in the rules for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, licensing the ability for non-governmentals to remote sense from outer space. It used to be a very onerous process, and fundamentally the former process basically treated everybody the same way no matter what they were going to be doing with it. The new regulations, the new process, basically what it does is it looks at the type of data that's going to be obtained, and based on that stacks it into the data into tiers. And depending on the tier, there may be there might be a higher level of licensing or scrutiny involved in order to obtain a license. So I think the tier system is going to be very beneficial for commercial entities or non-governmentals when they're getting licensing for remote sensing, and it kind of makes things a little bit, instead of making it one size fits all, it has basically has different sizes for different levels of data. Again, I won't go into too much detail here. If you subscribe to my briefing letter, I mentioned this back. I think it was I believe it was the third quarter 2020 issue. I talked about these and basically laid it out in a table to the different tiers. So again, hugely significant because this does simplify remote sensing laws, and NOAA basically having authority is basically a licensing authority for Article 6 authorization and supervision under the Outer Space Treaty. MEV-1 and Intelsat 901, and we talked about this early this year, where MEV-1 basically attached itself to Intelsat 901 and brought it back into useful operation. Now, that was highly significant from a technical standpoint, but I think, as we discussed before in an earlier video, this is huge. This has implications for outer space law. In other words, we're making state practice, or making acceptable practice, or I'm going to use the norm word again, norms for outer space, just by performing these types of activities. And the more these become commonplace, the more they still get accepted as international practice, or accepted international practice, even customary international law. So this is a very big deal, in my opinion, for 2020, in that we're actually doing new things out there and gaining acceptance for these practices. And I kind of contrast that with the a Russian inspector satellite that kind of saddled itself up close to an U.S. intelligence gathering bird, where the U.S. kind of pushed back on the Russian Federation, said, no, we don't consider that acceptable practice. So a lot's going on in orbit that it hasn't really actually been specifically written about or rules made about, and we're actually creating international law or international practices, but at the same time saying, okay, this isn't acceptable, other activities aren't acceptable as well, without having to sit down and write formal rules for it and then going off and doing it. Finally, Moon Village Association. Moon Village has been very active for the past couple years. I've been following them off and on, but I've just started talking about it in my briefing letter. And of course, I mentioned this in my hot list for the fourth quarter. I know a lot of the people involved in Moon Village. I don't necessarily agree with the approach. I don't think it's the proper approach, and I think it's kind of the antithesis of the Artemis Accords. As the whole idea of the standards and practices that the Moon Village Association is pushing, in my opinion, is top-down and looking for a treaty as opposed to bottom-up efforts outside of the UN, like the Artemis Accords and Executive Order 13914, and of course the whole domestic space law approach as well. I think it's more viable. The Artemis Accords, in a sense, are a more viable approach in that things will get done faster and they'll be more flexible to add on to the rules, as opposed to a Moon Village approach or a top-down approach that makes the rules and says, okay, well, these are the practices and you've got to adhere to them, instead of, well, this is what we're doing, so maybe we should make some rules or some guidelines about it. Again, Moon Village Association has been very active. I think they're going to be presenting some things to the UN next year. Next year is tomorrow, if you're still on Eastern Standard Time, basically, I think they're highly significant and worthy of watching. Again, I'm not a fan, just because I prefer the bottom-up approach of the Artemis Accords versus a treaty approach. So that's my top 5 hot item list for 2020, in addition to my hot list for fourth quarter 2020. So I'm going to end this like I do all, inviting you to, if you're not a subscriber to the Pressy, or if you've been a subscriber in the past and just dropped off, I'm inviting you to come back again as a subscriber. This is the cover page to my fourth quarter 2020 issue. I put out 4 quarterly issues a year, usually in the last week, the last Friday of the month, plus special issues in between. On special issues basically focus on more specific topics and do a lot more in-depth analysis. I know those have been popular with a lot of my subscribers. I keep my prices reasonable. I understand that, we're all on a budget, and especially what's been going on in 2020, this has been, it's been a hard year for everybody. But what I will do, if you email me at the info@thepressy.net, I'll be happy to send you a sample copy of a quarterly issue and a special issue. What I'll do is I'll send you the third quarter 2020 as opposed to the fourth quarter, and also a special issue to give you an idea what special issues look about. You can go to thepressy.net, and you can look. I have I talk about the Pressy a little bit more, as well as I have a price listing and some PayPal buttons. Or if you want to do a credit card, you can give me a call and we can do a credit card as well. So again, not only do I encourage you to become a subscriber to my channel, but also encourage you to subscribe to the Pressy. And I've been doing this for going on 5 years, actually, starting next year, and it's been quite popular with my subscribers, and I've gotten a lot of great feedback about it. So anyways, as I said, this is New Year's Eve right now here on Eastern Standard Time, and 2020 is going to be fading into the history books, and we'll start with 2021. What's going to happen at this juncture, who knows? I mean, it's really opened up, but let's hope for the best. Please stay safe and please stay healthy. And I will talk to you next year.